Once upon a time in a land far, far away, there were three minions named Bob, Kevin, and Stuart who worked for a supervillain named Scarlet Overkill. But one day, while looking around the house, they stumbled upon something that made their eyes pop out of their sockets. It was a pile of delicious bananas sitting on a very tall, wobbly shelf. The minions all gazed longingly at them, especially Bob, who looked incredibly distraught. Ban a nod pooey, he said in a sad, whiny gibberish. Kevin and Stuart looked at each other, knowing they had to do something about Bob's sadness. So Kevin pointed at the bananas and said in determined gibberish, "Minions, point, banana." Stuart nodded and added, "He, gelato." Then they looked over at Bob and said, "Washington, Washington, we Washington." Their plan was set. Now, the only problem was they were pretty bad at plans and even worse at fetching bananas. And this pile of bananas was extremely high up, like 10 feet up. But that didn't stop them from trying, of course. Their first attempt was simple. They would just stack on top of each other. Bob, being the smallest, would be on top. Stuart would help him out by lifting him up and pushing him gently, and Kevin would be on the bottom, holding everything together. Gack, bobble, yelled Kevin. He pushed Bob up to the top with a mighty shove. However, things didn't go exactly as planned. Tim, pap oi, screamed Bob as he flailed his arms wildly, almost losing his balance. The stack wobbled violently and suddenly came crashing down. In a heap of arms and legs, the minions groaned and slowly got back up. Their fur was ruffled and their eyes were filled with determination. This wasn't gonna be easy, but they couldn't give up. Not only did they need these bananas to cheer up Bob, but if Scarlet Overkill found out that they let Bob be sad, they'd get the living crap zapped out of them. And trust me, no minion wanted to remember what that felt like. That was some evil crap right there. So they tried again, but this time with a little more ingenuity. Bob stood next to the shelf, reached out and grabbed the bottom of a nearby ladder. Kevin then grabbed the top of the ladder, and they started to pull it towards the bananas. Baya, hoped Kevin, but it wasn't good enough. The ladder was way too short. It only reached about halfway up the shelf. It was clear that none of them were reaching those bananas unless they did something crazy. So they did what any rational minions would do. They started running in circles. They ran and ran until they were dizzy and out of breath, then jumped up and down, chanting, "Bananas, bananas, give us bananas." But nothing happened. The bananas remained on the shelf. Mocking them, the minions slumped down, defeated. It seemed like their quest for bananas would end in failure, but Bob had an idea. He spotted a giant spoon on the floor and had a sudden burst of energy. Maybe they could use the spoon as a lever to knock the bananas down. "Pop-a-dum," he shouted, brandishing the spoon like a knight with a sword. Their plan was simple, really. Stuart would hold the base of the spoon steady while Bob slid the tip under the bananas and pried them off the shelf. But there was a bit of a problem, or actually a lot of problems. For starters, the spoon was really heavy and kept slipping. And secondly, Bob couldn't quite reach the bananas no matter how hard he tried. But the biggest problem was that the bananas were kind of stuck under some boxes. Bob needed a way to get the boxes out of the way. "Gelato," said Stuart, pointing to himself. He thought he had the perfect solution. He ran over to the boxes, took a deep breath and started pushing with all his might. However, he wasn't strong enough and the boxes just sort of scooted over a few inches. "A little more, please," said Bob, sliding the spoon further under the bananas. Stuart pushed again, harder this time, and the boxes finally moved, revealing the bananas. Bob went to grab them, but he was too excited and knocked the entire pile off the shelf. The bananas rolled away, out of reach, and Stuart lost his balance and crashed to the floor. "Ha, Babble," laughed Stuart, pointing at the fallen minion. And before you knew it, the entire room was a disaster. Furniture was overturned, important-looking papers were scattered everywhere, and random items were lying on the floor in strange places. As Bob and Stuart looked around in dismay, Kevin inspected a nearby rope. An idea popped into his head. He pulled the rope taut and swung it towards the bananas. "Gotcha,"
Yeah.
he said triumphantly. They used the rope to make a lasso and carefully maneuvered it around the bananas. Finally, they had them in their grasp, but wait, they had to get them down without dropping any. "Pwah, pwah, pwah," Kevin instructed, swinging the rope side to side. Bob held on tight to the lasso as Stuart gave the bananas a final yank. One by one, the bananas were successfully lowered to the ground, but not for long. Suddenly, the rope snapped and all the bananas flew through the air. Some landed on Kevin's head, others bounced off the walls, and a few even hit Stuart in the face. "Ow," he said through a mouthful of banana. Bob watched as the last banana sailed through the air and disappeared behind a large potted plant. He walked over and peeked around the pot. To his surprise, he saw not a banana, but a small toy rocket. It was about the size of a real rocket, complete with wings and a chimney. Popham, Washington, he shouted excitedly. The minions looked at each other, then back at the rocket. They knew what they had to do. Somehow they managed to strap themselves to the rocket. Then Bob lit a match and shoved it into the chimney. There was a huge plume of smoke and a comical whoosh. The rocket shot into the air, narrowly missing the ceiling fan. It circled the room twice, dodged a bookshelf, zoomed past the aquarium, and finally crashed into the wall with a loud thud. The minions tumbled out of the rocket, dizzy but victorious. The rocket landed directly onto the shelf, knocking the remaining bananas down. The minions cheered and grabbed the bananas, then munched on them happily. They were finally going to have the best banana smoothie ever. Meanwhile, Scarlet Overkill entered the room and stopped in her tracks. She looked around at the destruction, then at the minions covered in banana mush. She raised an eyebrow, then shrugged, "Whatever," she said, and walked away. The minions continued to feast on their prize, completely oblivious to the mess they had made. As they munched on bananas, they roared with laughter and sang silly songs. They felt great. Bob was no longer sad, and that made Kevin and Stuart feel better too. After all, they were minions and minions were supposed to be happy. But as the sun began to set, they realized that their fun had taken its toll on the house. The furniture was still overturned, the papers were still scattered, and the rope was still tangled on the floor. "Oh," said Kevin, "we better clean up before Scarlet Overkill comes back." So the minions got to work. They swept the floor, dusted the shelves, and put the furniture back in its place. They even managed to fix the ladder and hang the pot back on the wall. By the time Scarlet Overkill returned, the house looked as if nothing had ever happened. She entered the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water. "Well, that's odd," she said. "I could have sworn I saw a bunch of bananas on the shelf earlier." She shrugged it off and went to her bedroom, leaving the minions to clean up the rest of the mess. As they worked, they couldn't help but reminisce about their great banana rescue. They had faced many obstacles, but they had triumphed in the end, and that made them feel like true heroes. Well, maybe not true heroes, but at least somewhat heroic. The end.